Okay, the book of Ezekiel, from which today's first reading was taken, is notable, among other things, for its startling imagery. The book begins with a mystical vision of storms and flashing fire, creatures with human faces and lions' faces and eagles' faces, and amidst of all this, coals of fire flying about. Disturbing images, perhaps reflecting, as Karen Armstrong suggests, Ezekiel's devastating experience of the exile. Later in the book, there is the familiar vision of the valley of the dry bones. I'm not going to dwell on those remarkable images, just noting that they're one of the striking features of this book. The time frame for today's reading is at the beginning and into the 6th century BCE. It was a time when two great imperial powers, Egypt and Babylon, were battling for supremacy, and the people of Israel and their kingdom caught in the middle. The passage we heard a few minutes ago is set in the time of the exile. It speaks of when God will lovingly restore and shepherd the people of Israel. And all this is in stark contrast to what is described earlier in the same chapter, it wasn't in today's reading, which describes the harsh treatment the people received from their leaders, who before the exile lived off the fat of the land, completely ignoring their needs and their suffering. In contrast to that, in the passage we heard, God will bring the Israelites back to their own land, feed them with good pasture on the mountains of Israel, seek out the lost, bind up the crippled, strengthen the weak, and feed them with justice. Okay, I'll come back to that powerful vision in a minute. The second part of the reading from Ezekiel, this is set before the exile, speaks of judgment. Judgment against those leaders described as fat sheep who thrust at the weak with their horns, scattering them like prey. However, the passage goes on to say, God will give the people a true shepherd, a prince who will be their true shepherd. And the prince reference here harkens back to King David, regarded as the iconic king, despite all his obvious flaws. Well, a number of things to pay attention to. First, and this is pretty obvious, the image of the Good Shepherd is prominent in both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. Times and places where the raising of sheep was an important element in the economy. So the Good Shepherd becomes a metaphor, an important metaphor for the relationship of God to God's people. That's clear in the Ezekiel passage, and there is the well-known parallel in John's Gospel where Jesus is described as the Good Shepherd. It's a strong image. And even today, in a totally different cultural milieu, many people find solace in the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, therefore can I lack nothing. Well, maybe I'm laboring the obvious about the importance of the shepherd image, so let's move on to look at the idea of judgment in both the Ezekiel passage and the gospel passage from Matthew. I've already noted that in the Ezekiel passage, there is judgment against the fat sheep who treat the weak ones like prey. Rich and powerful leaders treating their people with brutal indifference, like Donald Trump, indifferent to the impact of COVID-19 on the American people. Okay, let's turn to that famous passage from Matthew, which we heard just now. First, a bit of clarification about sheep and goats. In that period during the day, sheep and goats flocked together. But at night they had to be separated because the goats needed to be kept warm. Sheep were valued more than goats, but goats were not bad, even though this passage has come to be interpreted in a way that has given goats a very bad name. There's been some rehabilitation of the goat image recently. Just over a year ago, Lee and I were down visiting family in New York, and I brought down a couple of sweaters for the teenagers, a Maple Leaf sweater for one and a Raptors sweater for the other. This is just before the Raptors won the NBA championship. But their response was enthusiastic. The 15-year-old proclaimed, "You are the GOAT," which translated, GOAT, greatest of all time. Well, a somewhat extravagant compliment, but naturally I was delighted. Anyway, the goat image clearly under rehabilitation. Anyway, the point in the story from Matthew is that the king makes an act of separation, just as the keeper of the sheep would do at the end of the day. But the king is separating, to put it simply, the just from the unjust, the compassionate from the indifferent. But what seems to be implied here, and this is the way the story is often understood, is that this is the way it will be at the final moment of reckoning, at the last judgment. The good, the just, will inherit the kingdom prepared for them from the foundation of the world, and others will be rewarded with eternal fire. Now, this idea of a literal last judgment with rewards and punishment is an idea that most of us would have difficulty with, to put it mildly. And in fact, in John's gospel, and this is important, the focus is on the present, not a future day of reckoning. In John's gospel, and I quote, "Now is the judgment of this world." Well, let's take those words of Jesus in John's gospel as a given. Now is the time of judgment. The Greek word for judgment is crisis. And different times and different moments present different crises. Today we face a host of them. A homeless crisis, a pandemic crisis, a climate crisis, a poverty crisis, a racial crisis. How do we respond now to these moments of judgment, these moments of crisis? This is the issue of judgment for us. A bit more than can be addressed on a single Sunday morning homily. But the vision given in Ezekiel and implied in Matthew give an important part of the answer. In both cases, the vision is of a community, a people, a society where the hungry are fed, the naked are clothed, the stranger is welcomed, the sick are cared for. All that couldn't be clearer. Well, let me change the focus a bit. Today is traditionally known as the Feast of Christ the King. We're not big on hierarchies around here, but let me recall that famous passage in Luke's Gospel where Jesus says, "The kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over the people. But for you, let the leader be one who serves." No lording over, no power over. This is a different view of kingship. So when we celebrate the Feast of Christ the King, this is what we're celebrating, the one who serves. Well, let me try to summarize and pull these strands together. In Ezekiel and Matthew, there is the picture of the vulnerable being treated with dignity. The hungry fed, the stranger welcomed, the naked clothed, and the sick cared for. I would suggest that being treated with dignity, being treated with care, being treated with love is actually empowering. So a leadership that serves, that cares, is a leadership that empowers, that enriches life. This is true in our own community. And though we're small in numbers at Holy Trinity has demonstrated all this in its work with refugees, welcoming the stranger, in its work with the homeless, and in our mutual caring for one another. And this vision needs to be the vision we embrace nationwide, and we should settle for nothing less. This is our vocation, to work for this vision locally and for our whole country.